shop.
Oh, hey, you're here, I'm here, so that must mean it's time for a new episode of What's in the Shop. As always, thanks for joining me, and well, I think I got some interesting stuff today. We're going to talk about two records today, but of course many other artists related to it, but two main albums that both came out in 1983. The weird thing to keep in mind in this too, both of these albums that we talk about are the third album put out by both of these artists. One of them was the band's last album, and then the band broke up, and the other album is the album that put the other band on the worldwide stage for worldwide stardom and just sent the trajectory that way. And it all revolves around unrequited love, more or less. Or you could look at it as 10cc said, the things we do for love. Or, as Rod Stewart said, ain't love a bitch. However you slice it, there's good and bad that comes out of unrequited love, or love in general, let's just say. We're starting out with the band from up north in Glasgow, Scotland. We're talking about Altered Images. This here is their third album, Bite, which happened to be the band's last album. Had 4 singles on this album, and well, they had changed direction and whatnot, and sadly it was their last album, as I mentioned. But to me, it was my favorite. I do think it's my favorite. When this album came out in 83, I actually had 2 copies on vinyl and 1 cassette version. That's how crazy I was for this record. But anyway, before we get into the meat about this album, let's talk a bit about what was going on with Altered Images and how they got up to this point and what's their background. Real quick, Clare Grogan, by the way, that's who fronts Altered Images, was working at a waitress, let's say this is 1980, 79, 80, somewhere around there. Working at a waitress in a little cafe there in Glasgow. She gets approached by a guy who says, hey, I'm making a movie. You want to be in a movie? I'm sure all you ladies out there have heard that line before. She said no, turned him down, whatever. He was persistent, came back again, saw her again, asked her again, do you want to be in a movie? Anyway, make a long story short, he signed her. The movie was Gregory's Girl, which turned out, funnily enough, I think the British film industry rated it as one of the top 100 British films of all times. Anyway, let's go back to that point, because that's a very key point. In the early 80s, Clare starts to film Gregory's Girl. At the same time, her and all her old school buddies, or 4 school buddies, I should say, they had started a band, Altered Images. Real quick, where did they get the name? Well, funnily enough, if you go back and you look, they claim, rock and roll lore claims, they got it from the back of the Buzzcocks Promises single. You'll look on the back. There's a design firm that did a bunch of album covers called Altered Images listed on there. They went on to do Duran Duran, Simple Minds, just tons of stuff in the 80s. They changed their name from Altered Images to Assorted Images. But the band Altered Images got their name from the back of that little Buzzcock single. Now, they were fans of what was going on. Clare was a big fan of X-Ray Specs, of Blondie, and of Susie and the Banshees. And in fact, all the group were such big fans of the Banshees, they were all members of the Banshees fan club. More on that in a second. Clare said that she was such a fan of the Banshees, supposedly, that she carried around a copy of Hong Kong Garden, the Banshees' first single, in her purse, just in case she ran into friends who hadn't heard the single, or an acquaintance like, hey, you want to check this out? So I would say that's a pretty big fan. Anyway, Altered Images started to do a little bit of gigging around Glasgow with another band you may have heard of, Simple Minds. Yeah, can you believe that? But that was all about to change. So, as a band, they're sitting together and they say, hey, we need to, let's get our band moving. Let's be bigger than Simple Minds. I'm sure someone had said that. So, they all got together, Altered Images, and they wrote the head of the Banshees fan club and asked if when the Banshees came to tour Scotland, they could open for the Banshees. Well, It never hurts to ask. That's what my parents always told me. It worked. The Banshees came through on their Kaleidoscope tour in 1980 and let Altered Images open. Well, this helped really boost the band's stature. In fact, so much so that Steve Severin took a liking to him. He's the Banshees bass player, and actually produced their debut album, Happy Birthday. That came out in 81. Now, the band put out a second album. Let's talk about that first album real quick. It was a little dark. They were very poppy, mind you, Altered Images. Their image that itself was very frivolous, very fun, a lot of people like to say twee and impish. This had a lot to do with Clare's voice as well. Those of you who know Altered Images know what I'm talking about. Anyway, the first album was a little more dour, you could say. The second album came out in 82, and that was Pinky Blue, which had the big hit on it, I Could Be Happy. Great album. This record came out in 1983. Here's the thing. It would end up being the band's last album. Why? There was a little breakup in the band. After Pinky Blue and they did their touring and whatever, a couple of the members, said it's time to drop out. They didn't get good reviews for the second album, so they were a little frustrated. Clare had gone to France for a quick holiday, and when she came back, a new guy had been drafted in to replace the other two dudes who left, and his name was Steve Laroni. The first song they wrote together for this album, Bite, was a track called Don't Talk to Me About Love. That song would prove to be very important in two reasons. One, it was the band's very last top 10 single. It's a great song, by the way. Actually, one music magazine had said it was one of the defining songs of the summer of 83, along with a track from, I think, Oblivious from Aztec Camera, and I can't remember what the other tune was, but that's pretty good. Anyway, Clare and Steve sitting in a tree, Kissing. You know where I'm going with this, right? Funnily enough, Clare said she really hadn't had a serious boyfriend up to this point. And here she is sitting with this new guy who had just joined the band, and they're writing Don't Talk to Me About Love. Well, there must have been a twinkle in both their eyes, because as luck would have it, they ended up getting married. And they're still married to this day, so congratulations to Steve and Clare for that. Anyway, we're talking about the record. They wrote Don't Talk to Me About Love, became the band's last top 10 hit. I like this record, as I said. It is a more mature sound, and, well, look on the cover. That doesn't look very childish, does it? It looks kind of debonair and kind of suave with Clare all dressed up like that. Funnily enough, I mentioned that the band had, all the band were fans of Blondie. And they actually went to New York to record Don't Talk to Me About Love. I think they did the whole album there. And while they were in New York, the album was produced by Mike Chapman, who produced Blondie, Parallel Lines, as well as other stuff like The Sweet and a bunch of glam bands, Suzi Quatro and others. But anyway, supposedly, Clare Grogan had asked Mike if she could use the same microphone that Debbie Harry had used recording their previous record. And guess what? As they say, or as Clare had said, the mic she used to record that song was one that Debbie Harry had used. So, hey, maybe it had a little bit of luck on it. But, again, Bite, we're talking about this. Sadly, it was the band's last album, my favorite, and a couple of the music papers have said it was their favorites, too. But let me just tell you real quick about some of the singles. Some of the singles that came off of this were Don't Talk to Me About Love, Bring Me Closer, and Love to Stay, as well as Change of Heart. Again, I had all of those when they came out when I was a young man, and I still have them in my collection. I am a big fan of Altered Images, in case you haven't noticed. Love this record. Melody Maker said they weren't very keen on this when it first came out. The Melody Maker said, Bite really marks, it said, the move that Bite really makes with the times is a smartish in-step with those Barry Manilow of Soul Spandau boys. Who could they be talking about? We'll talk about that in a second. All Music had said that this was like ABBA gone funky. That Change of Heart, Another Lost Look, both great songs, and of course Don't Talk to Me About Love, are attractive pop that still retain some of the band's winsome charm. Classic Pop Mag, who I agree with on this, said this was their best. It said, yes, it's a difficult third album, and it got up to number 16 in the chart, so top 20, not bad, guys, was actually their best by far, and also their most grown up. Grogan had done away with her little hiccupy chirrups, for a more dignified sob and a series of disquisitions on love and loss. Yeah, there are some serious songs on here. Funnily enough, those of you who may have heard of Holly Beth Vincent, Holly and the Italians, she plays organ on this. Not too long after this, they fulfilled their contractual obligations, did their tour and whatnot, and broke up. Some of the bands that formed out of this, the bass player John McAloney, he went on to join Hipsway, which had a big hit with Honey Thief. Some of you may remember that. And then went on to form Texas with Charlene Spiteri, another great band. Also, another band that came out of the ashes of Altered Images back in the 80s is one in the 90s, kind of in that dubby, weatherall type rock meet dance type of vibe, called One Dove, which is worth checking out if you haven't heard that. So here we have it, Altered Images' last and best album, Bite. Now, I told you this was about unrequited love. How is that? Well, this here is the object of adoration of a young man in this band, Spandau Ballet. Remember that one review said that this album was keeping in step with those Barry Manilow of Soul boys, Spandau Ballet. Here we have it, Spandau Ballet. Also, these guys released an album in 81, 82, and 83, just like Altered Images. These guys are from London, Altered Images from up north in Glasgow. Spandau Ballet, again, just like Altered Images, had said after their first two albums, it's time to change the sound. They wanted to get more soul. In an interview, actually, Gary Kemp had said he wanted to sound more like Hall & Oates for this new record that would be. Now, how does this tie into Altered Images? Well, there's a couple reasons why. This track that the album's named after, True. Gary had a mad crush on Clare in Altered Images. In fact, this album is named after the song that Gary wrote for Clare. Now, a little bit about that. The band had had two singles released off of this. I think it was Lifeline and Communication before the record came out. Well, Lifeline had come out before the record, then Communication. But it was really the third single, the title track, that blew it all open. Now, at the time, as the story goes, Gary and Clare had crossed paths on the set of Top of the Pops, the British TV show. He was smitten with Clare, just totally knocked out, bowled over. He had gone up to Scotland to see Clare, hoping to win her heart. Of course, feeling wasn't the same, but she thought, nice kid. Here, I'll give him a little memento. She gave him a copy of Nabokov's Lolita book. So, when you go back and you listen to this, if you're smart, you may catch some mixed up or bits of lines that Gary had pulled out. And what Gary had done, he had wanted to send these little secret messages to Clare, hoping, oh my gosh, it would win her over, bowl her over with his plea of love, which was true. Well, the track didn't work. It didn't win Clare over, but it turned out to be Spandau Ballet's biggest single ever and their biggest selling album ever. So, hey, I guess something did work. Also, in True, which is weird, you know that line, I bought a ticket to the world? Gary had said he actually wrote that when he was coming up with the song. Of course, he's making a plea of love to Clare, but that line, he had said he was tired of playing London clubs and everything, and he wanted to get to he wanted superstardom, for lack of a better word. So I bought a ticket to the world, like, enough with London, I'm buying a ticket to go see the world. And it worked. That song worked, the album worked. Funny little thing about this one as well, that the album funnily enough, wanting to sound like Hall & Oates. They wanted to be more soul-y as well, to get away from the whole club scene. Just like Altered Images, it's time to make a change, get more adult, more soul, more jazzy. But it was kind of inspired, the whole sound that Gary was going for, because their guitar player, Steve Norman, I think was his name, he played guitar on the first 2 albums as well. He had bought a saxophone after the second album and started messing around with the sax. And they said, hey, why don't we incorporate some more sax? So you take the idea to let's get more soulsy and sax and combine it with I want to sound like Hall & Oates, and you get the biggest album of your career. Great album. Now, another interesting twist that all revolves around the Unrequited Love was that Gary was mad for Clare in Altered Images. See this? This artwork is done by the same guy who did Altered Images artwork for their previous albums and singles, and he went on to do the artwork for this album and their following singles for this album. So another little interesting bit about this. I was a late comer to this album, wasn't really into it when it was out at the time because I was into Altered Images. But now I really appreciate this album, and it is a great album. If you don't own it, you should buy it. Let's take a quick look at some of the things that the critics said about it. Don't believe me, necessarily. No, you should believe me. But let's see what the critics had to say as well. One of my favorite things that was said about this actually came from Rolling Stone. Can you believe it? The American rag said that True remains creepily fascinating. I think that's a great review, actually. The Enemy did not like this record at all. In fact, they called it milksop, funk pap. That's what the Enemy said. But again, what do they know? These guys went on to the world stage. Who knows about the guys who wrote that review for the Enemy? No one. Smash Hits, a big English magazine that we refer to a lot in the 80s. They're a big music magazine. They said True is less interesting. What? I agree. True is less interesting than the first 2 albums, the previous Spandau LPs, but much more enjoyable. 100%, I agree with that. And Record Mirror, another big weekly music magazine, said, enter into True with a mind free of preconceptions, and you'll wallow in a chunk of creamy, dreamy funk with satisfyingly round edges. I think that sums this up good. So anyway, that ties us up for our brief little story of Unrequited Love and how these 2 bands are intertwined and how the Unrequited Love worked or perhaps didn't work for some people. So once again, just running through this, Spandau Ballet, their 3rd album, put them on the world stage, made them world superstars because of True, which was a love song that Gary Kemp had written for Clare Grogan of Altered Images. Bite was their 3rd album and the last of their career at that time. As I mentioned, they just put a new album out 40 years after this one, just recently, called Mascara Streaks. So if you're an Altered Images fan, check it out. Altered Images, sadly at this time though, this was their last album at that time in 1983, and then the band dissolved except for Clare and Steve Leroni. Once again, guys, thank you so much for spending a few minutes with me. I appreciate it, and I appreciate all your comments and your notes. You can always send email, noisyrecordsmx@hotmail.com, or put a comment here wherever you're watching, on YouTube or here on Instagram. Leave me a note or send me a note or a comment. I appreciate all the input, and I appreciate you spending time. You guys take care. Hope to see you guys in town that are here soon. Come by the shop. Otherwise, everybody, keep on rocking.